Now, in this segment, we're going to be looking at the various movements that have been spawned by the revival in 1948. When I first began to explore this, I identified 7, but in this segment, Jim's identified 9. So it really shows how the breadth of influence is very, very strong. So, Jim, why don't you share with us the various streams that have come out of the latter rain revival?
Okay. The largest one was called the Revival Fellowship in the beginning. They've changed the name since, and I haven't tried to memorize what their new name is. But it started with Rev'd from Vancouver, and odd thing, he and George, did I mention yesterday about George Houghton and he making an agreement?
Yes.
Yes. Well, when he, after he, at George Houghton's invitation, went to North Battleford, he returned to Vancouver, and within a few months, the Houghton party came out to Vancouver.
Yes.
And then he took that, and there's a tremendous impetus that came from their 6-week visit in Vancouver. And Rev'd met up with David Schock in California. He met up with Leonard Fox and George Evans, and then they went up to Dick Iverson's church and introduced worship in the Spirit, the heavenly choir, and the presbytery. And poor Dick had problems making that church go. It just wouldn't go back in 62, 63, 64. But after Reg and David came, that church took off and became one of the key churches in all of Portland.
Oh.
So the Revival Fellowship then had Rev'd, it had these other churches I've mentioned, Green back in Alabama or Louisiana, somewhere down that area, and then the Beals in Detroit. And but pretty soon 100 churches were in this fellowship, some very large and very influential, and they had a passion for what God had done in North Battleford, and they took this to the best of their ability in the leading of the Spirit, and they all changed a bit. You go from church to church, and where the presbytery concept was at North Battleford wasn't quite the same later on, but that's par for the course, so no problem. So this particular fellowship became very, very strong. They met annually. This was the large and fellowship out of all of them. They all sprang up, some of them simultaneously. So it's not a particular order, but this one, no doubt, was moving within 1948. There's no doubt about that. It started that early. At the same time, there was a contact with Elim in northern New York, and Bob Mumford taught there at that school. And they didn't have much direct contact, but nonetheless, different ones that were touched by North Battleford, maybe first or second hand, started to travel around, and Elim was touched. I don't know whether it was directly or indirectly, but pretty soon God used them in a new way. They started writing scriptures and putting them to music. Same way as the Presbyterians put the Psalter to music, the Psalms, so Elim put individual scriptures. Psalm 23:6, surely goodness and mercy, that came out of Elim. And many, 300 at least, wonderful choruses, all of Psalm 100, all of Psalm 23. And we blessed God for what happened in Elim. Out of Elim, too, Ern Baxter first didn't immediately get going on this, but then later on through the Beals, he was caught up into the latter rain daughter movements. And he went to Elim, and a fellow there by the name of Richard Riss heard him and was so fascinated that he moved from Elim to Vancouver, BC, to Regent's College so he could attend Ern Baxter's meetings. He no sooner got there than Ern Baxter got me as his associate and took off for 5 months to Australia and New Zealand. And Richard was devastated. And Ern said, well, Jim will look after you just as good as I could. Meet with him once a week. So he had a very long face. He said, what'll we do? I said, well, why don't you give me your testimony? So he told me about his dad was a medical doctor, brain or heart surgeon, I can't remember, but he was a sharp young fellow and a violin player and different things. And then the next week he said, well, tell me your testimony. When I hit North Battleford and the Latter Rain movement, he nearly took off. He said, I have been trying to find somebody who knew something about that, and I haven't been able to get hold of them. He said, if I could get permission to write my master's thesis at Regents on the Latter Rain history, would you give me 5 hours where I could question and answer you and get information and give me all the contacts that I could do? So I said, sure. So he got permission from a professor. He said, yes, I'll mentor you on writing your thesis. And it was very, very, very good. Anyway, he wrote his thesis, and I helped him get it published. I helped him raise the money so that it would be published. And it has had quite an effect roundabout. Men like, who's the professor? Well, his name will probably come to me later, but there's a professor down from Dallas that was used in the prophetic area.
Jack Deere?
Jack Deere.
Yes.
Jack Deere contacted Richard, got his thesis, and it was very helpful to him in writing one or two of his books.
Now, Richard made an interesting observation about the latter rain combined with the evangelical awakening.
Yes, he did.
And why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
His book was called The History of the Latter Rain Movement and the Concomitant Evangelical Awakening. And he said those two were hermetically sealed from one another and didn't touch each other from 1948 to, somewhere around 1967. Then they came together, and in their unity, they produced the Charismatic Renewal.
Oh.
So
interesting observation.
that was Richard Reese's observation, and as a matter of fact, it was the title of his book. The whole thing was on this very thing, that these two movements came together later on for the glory of God. The third movement was George Warnock. He was born in North Battleford, left there, went to Vancouver. He became Ern Baxter's assistant, and the same way Ern Baxter read how the great Baptist preacher Spurgeon in London had one associate that used to lay out, he'd give him the text that God had given him to preach on that Sunday morning. He would lay out 100 books from Spurgeon's library, open at the proper place that directed him to that text. Spurgeon would walk around this huge table, read them all, and make up his sermon for Sunday morning.
Wow.
And Ern thought, that's a good idea. So he had George Warnock do that for him in Vancouver. And he had a library of some 17,000 volumes, so it was interesting to go through them all. George mastered them and did an excellent job. And but then when the latter rain outpouring came in 48, he went back to North Battleford to see what God was doing in his hometown. And he helped them out. And they asked me to teach a course on whatever I wanted to. And I happened to bring up about Leviticus 23 and how Mrs. Mary Bertha Alquist from Port Alberni asked me if I would listen to her and regard the 7 feasts of the Lord from that portion of the Bible. And she said, Passover, Jesus fulfilled. Pentecost, the Holy Spirit fulfilled. Tabernacles, that won't be fulfilled till Jesus returns the second time. So I brought this out. Now, George Warnock knew that, But the way she said it to me, I was able to put it across with her spirit, I guess, because he said the Spirit of God grabbed me and wouldn't let me go till I wrote that book, The Feast of Tabernacles.
Wow.
So George Warnock, with that book, though it held dormant for 10 years, didn't do anything. Finally, Bill Britton from Springfield, what state is that from? Missouri, Springfield, Missouri. He asked for a bunch of these books, and George Warnock told him it isn't selling. He said, well, I wasn't thinking of that. I was wondering if you'd give me permission to reprint it, and I'll make it available worldwide, and we'll work out something where it'll be proper for royalties for you. So they did, and the thing took off, and it's gone into 20 languages and all over the world. So Bill Britton was for George Warnock what others have done
Isn't
for
that
different
amazing?
writers.
Yes.
Yeah, it was absolutely tremendous, and he had a vision for it. He said, this book is going to go.
Yes.
It is probably, it's almost considered to be the Bible of this first movement, the Revival Fellowship.
That's what I first was exposed to through a friend in Nova Scotia, Jerry Fuller.
Is that right?
Yeah, years ago. So that whetted my appetite.
Yes. Well, George Warnock said to me, now, maybe I haven't written this just the way you would have, but the Spirit just grabbed me and wouldn't let me go. And in 51, it came out. Finished the book and set it out.
Right.
And it's been I've seen it used. Later on, we'll get to another denomination. I'll mention it here. Bill Britton of Springfield, Missouri, soon heard about the outpouring there in northern Canada, and he entered into it strongly. And he's written many, many books, and they're all tinctured by the effect of that movement upon him. He wrote one, The Harness of the Lord. It's just gone all over the world, and it's absolutely tremendous how two horses one was disciplined and the other wasn't. And the disciplined one became a member of the king's chariot and everything. The other one never amounted to a row of beans. And he said, that's what God is saying to us. We need to be disciplined. And if we're not disciplined, we won't count in the kingdom of God. We'll be like that scruffy little horse that never would pay the price. And
It's a powerful idea,
yes,
isn't
it's
it?
a very powerful thought. And Bill Britton, he had also another aspect that came out from his movement. It was called sonship, and it became very popular, and it traveled around the world too, and it probably came to maturity through his movement more than any other. He probably developed it and matured it, and his books show this a great deal. The fifth one that I came across was Abbot Loop from Alaska. And Dick Benjamin was connected with that, was a good friend of Dick Iverson. He contacted a friend of mine down in Eureka, California, Jim Durkin. And Jim Durkin had an outfit called Go Ye Fellowship. And he was touched because of Dick Iverson and Dick Benjamin with the North Battleford thing, though it was maybe third hand by that time. But he made good use of it. And when Marie and I were down in Eureka, Arcata, California for 6 years, from about 67, was it 76 to 82, 76 to 82. In that time, Jim got very interested in the presbytery concept, the fivefold ministry, but he had picked up a lot of that from Dick Iverson and from Dick Benjamin. Dick Benjamin was absolutely amazed at how Jim Durkin was used with that impetus for North Battleford, to start new churches. So what he'd do, he never had a church that got too big. Instead, he'd get up to 150, and then he'd give 30 members to another city. Oh. And they would go there, and in nothing flat, they'd almost be bigger than Mama Church. And he did some 40 or 50 churches this way. 40 to 50 churches started up through Jim Durkin. Dick Benjamin did even better than Jim Durkin did. He took the concept and he was just excellent at it. So these two movements of Abbott Loop from Dick Benjamin and from Jim Durkin down in Eureka, California, these two were almost twin movements in a sense. They multiplied themselves by giving, spotting a city to some 15 to 20 or 30 members, and that would become the nucleus that could swiftly move in evangelism and growth. And God really blessed Go Ye Fellowship and blessed Jim Durkin. And the impetus, there's no doubt about it, with Dick Benjamin, the presbytery concept was working. Many of the other concepts from 1948 were working too. The heavenly choir, spiritual singing, these things were all part and parcel of what was going on. But probably the most controversial daughter movement of all of them was one formed by John Robert Stevens called the Walk, or the Church of the Living Word, down in the Los Angeles area. Part of it was in Van Nuys. He had another church down in the south part of L.A. John Robert Stevens was a very effective leader. He was a good pastor. He was apostolic, there's no doubt about that. And he raised up many, many apostles. But he'd been hurt in two different movements, and as a result, he had withdrawn from other leaders, and he had no peer leaders that could speak on his behalf, to where they could sort of help one another, rub off the rough edges. And he felt that this was one of the big reasons why he later fell. He said, if I had have been with a peer group, this would never have taken place. We would have protected one another. And John Robert Stevens put out thousands of pamphlets and booklets and books and tapes. They went all over the world. And he was an excellent teacher. To read his stuff was excellent. Marie and I have used his works on prophecy, how to guide prophecy in church meetings and make it count the most. Excellent, just excellent. His work along this line was very, very good. But pretty soon, his prophecy started to slip off a bit. Here's an example. He asked his elders, have you noticed that the last 2 years as I've been doing spiritual warfare, anything has happened in my life? And they said, yes. We have noticed that beyond your aura, your molecules have been in conflict.
Oh my.
That's not only spooky, that's getting
true.
off into occultic stuff. And Bob McAllister, a Canadian whose father was head of a movement up there, Bob went to Brazil, and on his trip up to the United States on one occasion, he visited John Robert Stevens, and his library was half full of occultic books.
Well.
He said, John, get rid of it, burn it, this is bad. This will destroy you if you don't get rid of this. He didn't do it, and it destroyed him. He died a bitter man, and it need never have happened if he had have listened to people like Bob McAllister, who on a regular basis he was fellowshipping with. Richard Rist has a great deal in his book on the Latter Rain history on John Robert Stevens, because there is many commendable things there. There are things that we still make good use of. There's one interesting thing. He wrote one book on the Feast of Tabernacles, and he lifted Richard Riss's outline, George Warnock's outline on the Feast, where he had written on the Feast of Tabernacles, and he put that whole thing down. It's an excellent outline, but he didn't want to give any credit to Latter Rain or anyone else, but he should have. It's sort of plagiarism when you do that and you don't give credit for it. I used from others, but I always put down at the bottom a documentation where I got it from and why. So the next one, number 8 movement, is the discipleship shepherding movement. Some people are surprised that I would add that, but all those men were very close to what happened at North Battleford. They may not have contacted George Houghton and these other leaders personally, but they did get it from men like Reg Lazelle or the Beals, and as a result, they were moving in the presbytery concept, the fivefold ministry concept, the heavenly choir concept. They were walking in these major things that had been reintroduced and brought back after many, many years into the kingdom of God and to the church life. The chief man of that movement was Charles Simpson. He was a strong man, Southern Baptist in his background, and I think he retained that position throughout his ministry. There is also Don Basham came in early in that time. Derek Prince, Bob Mumford, John Poole was with them for a little while, whose father is quite well known, and Ern Baxter in 1973, when I became an associate with him in British Columbia and Surrey and Christian Center there, he was invited to go down there. It was quite interesting how it happened. They ran an article on one of his sermons without contacting him, his famous Eagle sermon. His nose was quite bent. And then they invited him down there because of it, and they made peace. They made peace so much that they invited him to join them and make it the Fab Five.
Now, you had indicated to him, gave him a bit of a warning. He said, don't go down there.
The discipleship shepherding movement was starting to become legal. And it was, in my words, they started to play God, not so much with the leaders, but the next string really were coming down on their people that they were discipling.
A lot of control.
Yeah, it was a spirit of control. It was a spirit of control. And I told her, and I said, I can sense that this whole movement is starting to move in that direction. If you do, he said, what do you think? Should I go down and join them or not? I said, if you do go down, help them to pull back from this controlled spirit. This controlling spirit is like a Jezebel spirit. It's not good. He went down and joined them. But then your predecessor at St. Luke's, Dennis Bennett, took a very dim view of the discipleship shepherding movement, and he made it his one of his high priorities to bring them to line with the Word of God, or something along that line. And he told me on one occasion, he says, being a watchdog of heresy is a most unthankful job.
That's true.
And there's 3 areas that he moved in very strongly along this line. And it really gets you when you push, even though it needs to be done. It's not a thankful job.
Yes.
Dennis Bennett was 100% right, Father Bennett. Anyway, that was quite interesting to watch that taking place, and it became a national issue. The first split in the charismatic movement read Charisma magazine or Logos, one of those things back in those days, and it was wild in those days. It was really wild.
Now, you've identified some other people like Kelly Varner that have been impacted. Tell us a little bit about some of those folks, and you identified that as another stream.
I do. I don't necessarily make it the 9th one, but I do say Kelly Varner took a tremendous interest in North Battleford. He collected everything that George Houghton wrote. He everything, and he fellowshiped with many in a movement that I don't move in, but he does, that are likewise interested in it. The fivefold ministry. They saw presbytery and prophecy was very strong. The heavenly choir and spiritual singing, that brought, so for that reason you could say yes, this could be the ninth daughter movement from the North Battleford days, and it would be legitimate, and they would probably say yes, that we have gained a great deal from having been with these folks. So these are the 9
Wow.
as I see them.
Well, what I'd like to do, just in closing, Jim, in this segment, is to look at the importance of relationships, because in each of the streams, it seemed that there were people that knew folks that were in North Battleford, and it sort of went, in that realm.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about the importance of relationships and then accountability around that, because there were people like John Robert Stevens who isolated himself.
Yes,
you see.
yeah.
So, any counsel in that regard?
I suppose that one of the things that happened, it happened in let's see if I can remember the year, 1971. Dennis Bennett returned from Florida, and he had been spending time with Bob Mumford, and they said, we've got to do something to bring the folk of the Charismatic Renewal, and most all of the Charismatic Renewal were aware of North Battleford, and that they had received blessing from that revival that had taken place previously. He said, we need to get together where in a morning and afternoon for 1 week, 50 of us could just meet and let our hair down and talk about our problems and get to know one another and work out a comity arrangement where we could covenant to protect one another and to handle our problems scripturally rather than talking behind one another's back. Mm-hmm. And Dennis said, I believe we have a group of pastors here in Seattle that could do that. He said, if you do, you'll need to supply us with an honorarium of at least $400 a week for everyone that comes, plus full transportation, plus room and board while we're there for that week. He said, I think we could do it. So he said, let me get back to Seattle. I'll check our pastors. If it works, Bob said, I can guarantee the 4 of us will be there. There'll be Derek Prince, Charles Simpson, Don Basham, and myself. I can guarantee that. And he said, out of 50, you might get 30. That's exactly what happened. Oh. Our folks said, let's do it. We will believe God for $14,000 for 30 men to look after them. It was closed session, round robin at night, so that in 5 different churches, if you stayed in that one church, the 30 speakers would come around. Wow. And you'd hear every one of them. Yeah. It was a week. And
well, that's part of the plan in the 50th anniversary coming up in 2010, that we're exploring doing that, and then culminating in the Key Arena. So that's an exciting, exciting model. We've got to close.
All right.
Bless you.